I clearly remember the moment when Rachel and we decided it was time to meet her family. We had been together for 6 months and our love seemed to blossom more every day. Rachel was a white woman, and I, an African American, had grown up in a family that always taught me to expect the best in people, but also to be prepared for the worst. These thoughts were crossing my mind when Rachel invited me to join her family for dinner. "Ethan, I really want you to meet my family," Rachel said to me one afternoon as we walked through the park. I looked into her eyes, searching for any sign of doubt or worry, but all I saw was excitement and love. "Are you sure?" I asked, trying to hide my nervousness. "I mean, are you sure they'll be okay with, you know me?" Rachel smiled, a smile that always managed to put me at ease. "Of course," he answered firmly. "My family is not racist. They will adore you, I'm sure of it." That night, after Rachel left, I found myself pensive in my bed. Part of me wanted to believe his words, blindly trust his judgment. But another part, one that had been shaped by years of family experiences and teachings, couldn't help but feel skeptical. Still, I decided to trust Rachel. If she believed everything would be fine, then she should give him the benefit of the doubt. The day of dinner came faster than I expected. I dressed carefully, wanting to make a good impression. Rachel picked me up, and during the ride to her parents' house, she tried to calm me down with small talk and jokes. "It'll be okay, Ethan," he said as he took my hand. "My family is great, you'll see." We finally arrived at his parents' house, a beautiful house in a quiet suburb. I took a deep breath before getting out of the car, trying to calm my nerves. Rachel smiled at me and gave me a quick kiss on the cheek before leading me towards the door. Rachel's mother, Linda, was the first to greet us. His welcome was warm, although I noticed a slight stiffness in his embrace. "Rachel, darling. And you must be Ethan." "Nice to meet you," Linda said with a wide smile. "The pleasure is mine, ma'am," I replied, trying to sound relaxed. Rachel's father, David, appeared shortly after, shaking my hand firmly. His gaze was appraising, but he tried to hide it with a polite smile. "Welcome, Ethan. I hope you are comfortable in our house." As the night progressed, I found myself becoming more and more anxious. The conversations were superficial, and although everyone tried to be friendly, there was a subtle awkwardness in the air. During dinner, David made a comment that made me uncomfortable. "In this house, we don't see colors, Ethan. We only see people," he said as he poured more wine. Rachel looked at me, trying to convey support, but I couldn't help but feel like something wasn't right. Linda, for her part, began asking questions that, although seemingly innocent, seemed invasive to me. "Ethan, tell us more about your cultural heritage. I have always found African American history fascinating." I tried to respond as politely as possible, but I couldn't help but feel like I was being scrutinized. Despite Rachel's attempts to keep the conversation light and pleasant, the tension in the air was palpable. After dinner, we sat in the living room to drink coffee. Rachel's brother Brad joined us. Initially, he seemed friendly, but I soon noticed that he avoided making eye contact with me and made inappropriate jokes about racial issues when he thought no one was listening. I felt caught between wanting to be polite and needing to defend myself. Later, in the car on the way home, I decided to talk to Rachel about my concerns. "Rachel, I don't want to be paranoid, but I felt like there was a strange tension tonight. Some comments from your family made me feel uncomfortable." Rachel sighed and looked at me with concern. "Ethan, I'm sorry if you felt that way. My family is trying to adapt. They are not used to situations like this, but I promise you that they have no bad intentions." I nodded, although not entirely convinced. I decided to give it one more chance, trusting that things would improve with time. However, subsequent family visits only increased my frustration. The microaggressions continued, and even though he tried to talk to Rachel about it, she always justified them, saying that her family just needed time to get used to it. One night, after a particularly tense visit, I found myself reflecting on my relationship with Rachel. He loved her, but was it worth continuing to endure those situations? I decided to give it one last chance, hoping things would change. The next family dinner was the breaking point. Everything seemed to be going well until Rachel's Uncle Tom made an overtly racist comment. I felt a wave of indignation and couldn't contain myself. "That's unacceptable," I said, getting up from the table. "I can't stay silent while listening to such offensive comments." Rachel, instead of supporting me, apologized for my behavior and led me out of the room. I felt betrayed and deeply disrespected. "Rachel, I can't believe you did that," I exclaimed once we were alone. "You should have supported me." Rachel looked at me with tears in her eyes.
I'm sorry, Ethan.
I didn't want things to get out of control. I was just trying to keep the peace. That night, I realized that our love was not enough to overcome the barriers of racism. Rachel ended our relationship days later, admitting that my skin color was a problem for her family and that she didn't see a viable solution. I felt devastated, but also more aware than ever of the painful reality of prejudice that still permeates our society. Rachel's words resonated in my mind, and although they hurt me, they also pushed me to face reality more directly and decisively. The air in Rachel's parents' house was thick with a tension that, though subtle, was palpable to me. From the moment we walked through the front door, I felt a kind of discomfort that I couldn't clearly define. Rachel, as always, was radiant and didn't seem to notice anything out of the ordinary. He grabbed my hand and led me directly to the living room where his family was already gathered. "Ethan, great to see you," Rachel's mother Linda exclaimed with a smile that seemed overly practiced. I walked over to give her a hug, but she extended her hand for a formal handshake. Already there, I felt the first pang of discomfort. "Hello, Mrs. Linda, it's a pleasure to be here," I responded, trying to sound as genuine as possible. David, Rachel's father, looked at me from his chair at the head of the table. "Ethan, welcome. We're so glad you could join us today," he said, as he stood up to shake my hand. His grip was firm, but something in his gaze made me feel like I was being evaluated. During dinner, the comments began to flow steadily and, although none were overtly offensive, they all had an overtone that made me feel watched and judged. "You know, Ethan, we don't see color in this family," David said, as he cut his meat with precision. "For us, all people are equal." I nodded, but inside I felt a knot in my stomach. "That's good to know, David," I replied, trying to stay calm. Linda, who was pouring more wine, leaned towards me with a curious smile. "Ethan, tell us more about your heritage. I have always found the cultural history of different ethnicities fascinating." I took a sip of water, feeling like all eyes were on me. "Well, my family is originally from the southern United States. We've been there for generations, and our heritage is a mix of many cultural influences." Linda nodded, but her smile was still that forced grimace. "How interesting. And do you have any special traditions that you follow?" Before he could respond, David intervened. "You know, Linda has always been interested in African American culture. It's something she studied in college." Rachel, who had been silent until then, tried to change the subject. "Mom, Dad, why don't we let Ethan enjoy his food? We can talk about other things later." I acknowledged his intervention with a look, but I noticed that the tension in the room did not decrease. For the rest of the dinner, the comments continued, each a reminder that despite the kind words, I was still a stranger in their world. After dinner, Rachel and I helped clear the table. While we were in the kitchen, I took the opportunity to talk to her. "Rachel, I feel a little uncomfortable with some of the comments your parents made at dinner," I said quietly, trying not to sound accusatory. Rachel sighed. "Ethan, they're trying to get to know you better. I don't think it was their intention to make you feel uncomfortable." I nodded, but couldn't help but feel frustrated. "Yes, but there's a way to do it that doesn't make you feel like you're under a microscope." Rachel looked at me with sympathetic eyes. I know. We'll talk about it later, okay? I just want this night to go well." We returned to the living room, where David and Linda were waiting for us with coffee and dessert. I tried to relax and enjoy the rest of the evening, but I couldn't help but feel like every word I said was being analyzed and every move I made was being watched. At the end of the night, as we said goodbye, David patted me on the shoulder. "Ethan, you're welcome here any time. I hope you had a good night." "Thank you, David. I appreciate the hospitality," I responded, although inside I felt like I hadn't been completely sincere. Linda walked us to the door. "Ethan, it was a pleasure meeting you. I hope we meet again soon." "Same here, Mrs. Linda," I responded, trying to remain cordial. On the way home, Rachel held my hand. "Thank you for coming, Ethan. I know it wasn't easy, but I think they're trying." I nodded, but couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. "Yes, Rachel, I know. But I hope you understand that it's not easy for me." She squeezed my hand tightly. "I understand. And I'm here to support you." However, he couldn't stop thinking about all the little signs he had noticed during the night. I knew this was just the beginning of a series of challenges I would have to face if I wanted our relationship to survive. And even though Rachel was on my side, she couldn't ignore the reality that her family, despite her words, still had a lot to learn about what it really meant to not see color. Rachel's brother, Brad, initially seemed friendly to me. He was tall, athletic, and always had a smile on his face. During our first family dinner, he approached me and asked me about my interests, my work, and my hobbies. The conversation flowed naturally, and for a moment I thought that, at least with him, there would be no problems. However, over time, I began to notice certain behaviors that made me feel uncomfortable. One afternoon while we were in the garden, Brad made a comment that chilled me. We were talking about music, and I mentioned that I liked jazz. Brad, laughing, said, "Oh, sure, you guys love jazz, right?" He said it in a way that made me feel like he was reducing my entire identity to a stereotype. I tried to ignore it, but something in his tone and expression made me feel uneasy. Another day, we were all sitting in the living room watching a basketball game. Brad, without taking his eyes off the television, commented, "Ethan, you should be out there. You sure are good at this." I felt a pang of irritation. Why did he assume that because he was black, he had to be good at basketball? I took a deep breath and decided not to respond, trying to keep the peace for Rachel's sake. The final straw was during a family gathering where Brad and his friends were in the backyard, drinking beers and laughing out loud. I walked over to join the conversation, and upon arriving I heard Brad say, "Yes, but you know how they are, always in trouble." The conversation stopped abruptly when they noticed my presence. Everyone looked at me awkwardly, and Brad, visibly nervous, tried to change the subject. Later that night, when Rachel and I were alone, I decided to talk to her about what had been going on. I sat on the couch, trying to find the right words. "Rachel, I need to talk to you about something that's been bothering me," I said, trying to stay calm. She looked at me worried and sat next to me, holding my hand. "Sure. Ethan, what's happening?" I took a deep breath and told him about Brad's comments and how they had made me feel. I hoped she would understand my frustration and sympathize with me. "Rachel, I feel like Brad is making inappropriate comments about my race. They aren't overtly racist, but they are hurtful and make me feel uncomfortable." Rachel frowned and sighed. "Ethan, I know it can be difficult, but you have to understand that my family is trying to adapt. They are not used to having someone from a different culture among us. Brad doesn't do it with bad intentions." I was frustrated by his response. I wasn't looking for excuses. I wanted him to understand that those comments, intentional or not, were hurtful. "Rachel, it's not about adapting or not. It's about respect. You shouldn't have to endure those comments just because your family isn't used to it." She nodded, but I could see she wasn't completely convinced. He hugged me and told me he would talk to Brad, but I couldn't help but feel like he was downplaying my feelings. Over time, the situation did not improve. Brad kept making inappropriate comments, and every time I tried to talk to Rachel about it, she simply said that I should be patient and give her family time to get used to my presence. One afternoon, after another tense visit to Rachel's parents' house, I decided I couldn't go on like this anymore. I felt exhausted and demoralized. I sat with Rachel in our living room and, with a heavy heart, said to her, "Rachel, I can't ignore this anymore. Brad's comments and lack of support from you are affecting our relationship. I need you to understand how serious this is to me." She looked at me sadly and nodded. "I know, Ethan. I'll talk to him again, I promise." But deep down, I knew that our previous conversations hadn't led to any real change. The relationship with his family was becoming an unsustainable burden for me. The tension continued to build, and although I loved Rachel, I couldn't stand the microaggressions and lack of understanding any longer. I found myself becoming more distant and anxious whenever a family gathering was mentioned. The situation finally came to a head during a birthday party for Rachel's mother. Brad was, as always, in the center of attention, telling stories and making jokes. I approached the group and, almost immediately, Brad cracked another of his jokes. "Ethan, will you teach us some dance moves later? You know, like they do in hip-hop videos." The situation finally came to a head during a birthday party for Rachel's mother. Brad was, as always, in the center of attention, telling stories and making jokes. I approached the group and, almost immediately, Brad cracked another of his jokes. "Ethan, will you teach us some dance moves later? You know, like they do in hip-hop videos."